US. My name is Nick Arnold, and I'm a constituent volunteer helping out with our LD10 Town Hall today. This is our March Town Hall, our third one that we've held in 2022, and I'm excited to be here with our Legislative District 10 legislators. Even though we are all now assorted into our new legislative districts, these three legislators were elected to LD10. They will continue to represent the old LD10 until the end of this year, and the next set of legislators are sworn in. A reminder before we get started that this is a legislative event, not a political event. So if you have any questions that orient around campaigns, partisan themed questions, we will probably not be talking about those. But we are excited to share what's been going on in the legislature, talk about some of the big issues that have happened this past week. And to kick us off, I am going to throw it over to Senator Stahl Hamilton to introduce herself, and then she will throw it over to Representative DeGrazia.
Good morning, everybody. It is a pleasure to be with you all this morning. Senator Stephanie Stahl Hamilton. I serve on the Natural Resources, Energy, Water Committee, Finance, and Judiciary Committees. And Domingo, why don't you go?
Good morning, everybody. Domingo DeGrazia, representative for the old LD10, I guess going into now 17. I am the Minority House Whip, and I also serve on Judiciary Committee and the Committee on Rules. And now we'll go over to Morgan.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you all for spending your Saturday morning with us. My name is Morgan Abraham. I'm a state representative, and I serve on Natural Resources and Rules.
Thank you all so much. So where we're at in the legislature this week is toward the end. Gracefully, we talked last time about crossover week, which was when the bills that passed through the Senate made their way over to the House and vice versa. We are now coming to the end of committees. And so Representative DeGrazia, could you speak a little bit to what that looks like in the legislature, what it means for committees to end, if any committees will keep going, et cetera?
Certainly, yeah. So the flow of bills or proposed laws in the Arizona legislature is that each chamber, the House and the Senate, will propose their own bills that have to go through the committee process and then go to the entire body. And if they pass, the bills that pass out of each chamber will then cross over to the other. And they have to go through the same process in the other chamber being heard in committees. And if they pass out, then theoretically, if they conform, they go to the governor. So where we are is that we've had our last day for hearing substantive bills in the crossover chambers. We all heard our bills in the House. We sent them over to the Senate. Senate sent theirs over to us, and we've heard all of the Senate bills. So now theoretically we're ready to hear those bills on the floor, and then we'll start hearing budget bills pretty soon. Hopefully, we're tasked with being done by about April 23rd. That rarely happens just because politics get in the way and there's a lot of horse trading that goes on. So we might be there until April 23rd. We might be there until June 23rd. It's anybody's guess.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, and to any audience members who are unsure about that, legislatures typically scope out the length of the session that they're supposed to fit. Arizona's is 100 days. That would be that April date. But the main charge of the legislature is, of course, to pass a budget for the state for the subsequent year. And so the legislature cannot firmly sine die, which is adjourned for the session until that budget is passed. Senator Stahl Hamilton, last time we talked, you mentioned something about strike everything bills and that part of the process. Could you speak a little bit to that and then also share your thoughts, especially as a freshman legislator who has been through one budget process, what you're looking toward for this next budget process?
Yes, thank you, Nick. And Domingo did a great job of laying out where we are in the session. And this strike everything. Typically, we start out, a lot of bills get dropped, some bills get heard, some bills make it through committee and then don't go any further than that. Some bills make it to floor through committee on the whole and third read, and then they don't go anywhere after that. And so a strike everything is when a legislator decides they'd like for their bill to get another chance if it doesn't make it through, and they find another bill that has not gone anywhere, and they'll strike the language of that bill and amend it with the language of their bill. So it takes two bills for strike everything. For example, we heard in Judiciary Committee this week a bill that died twice in the House. And it somehow, there was a bill in the Senate, it got attached to that Senate bill, and we heard it in committee. For me, that was particularly frustrating because number one, it was a pretty complex bill. There was a lot that went into it. I didn't think I think it was a pretty broadly based bill. I found it to be very problematic. And with the strike everything, we didn't get the language until the night before. So there was not enough time to dig in, and that's something Representative DeGrazia has been, he's been very good about sharing the perspective of how much time we spend with legislation, and the strike everything bills are even the worst. And we tend to see a lot of those in the last week of crossover week, because we know people know we're coming to the finish line, and it is sort of that last gasp for air. And absolutely a lot of horse trading has gone into that. And so typically when it's a strike everything, I am very, very skeptical that it is a bill that we should be voting on, let alone passing out of committee or even on the floor. So we spent a lot of time in our committees this week with strike everything bills.
Thank you so much for that overview. And I really appreciate the point about the time spent on legislation, because there's been a lot of reactions to some of the bills passed by the legislature, and a lot of misunderstanding about the time you all are granted to, work through each piece of legislation and not fully understand it. And it's often described as drinking from a fire hose, no matter how long you've been there. So thank you for that overview. And before we get into the bills that have been making their way through the session the past few weeks, I do want to spend a little time talking about budget. Last year, the session was a historically very, very long session because of the budget process and the majority caucus working exclusively within itself to find the votes to pass with a simple majority the 11 or 12 budget reconciliation bills that make up the Arizona budget. Because of the policy that was packed into those budget bills to pass, the Arizona Supreme Court actually struck down a lot of the policy because of multi-subject restrictions on legislation. Because of that, Senator Saul Hamilton, can you speak a little bit to what you're starting to hear, what you're anticipating as far as how this budget process could be a little bit different than the last one, if you think it might be as long of a session as last year's was? Any other thoughts that you have on budget?
Oh, I really don't want to predict. But the whispers we are hearing is that we will be in session again until June 30th. And there might be a few special sessions called after that to deal with specific issues. And let me put this out there, because this is my second session, and now I'm experiencing the budget over in the Senate. It's a very different process in the chambers. The House, the majority party spends a lot of time, behind closed doors working on the budget. But I have to tell you, the minority party does so as well. And they will take what we know about the budget, lay it all out, and put our priorities forward. That budget doesn't necessarily get heard, but it is something that the minority party works very hard on as well, to put out there to say that there are a myriad of options on how we can deal with our budget. Over in the Senate, I think it is mainly the majority party. I heard Senator Alston stand up on the floor this session and said every year she knows how to do a budget. She looks at the numbers, she makes her own budget, and she has always offered either to present that budget to the majority party, or she will ask to be a part of the budget conversation. So I think it does seem to be very one-sided most of the time. That's what I'm getting in both chambers. And so for me, we're in the hurry up and wait, and we never know when we're going to be called to the floor. So it's always trying to read the tea leaves or look at the signs and read what's happening, read the energy. I always equate it to my third trimester of pregnancy, where any day now we're ready to give birth. And so every little twinge, every little different change in the rhythm could be the day. But I would say the budget process is probably a lot more painful than giving actual birth.
That is quite the metaphor. Thank you so much, Senator Stahl.
I'm fine like mom. That's what I know.
We actually did get a question on something you briefly touched on. So if any of you want to take this, I think it would be interesting. We got a question about the rumors of a special session around repealing and replacing the tax bill from last session. Is that something that you all are hearing about? And if you want to briefly mention what you're hearing about a special session possibility.
I can jump in on that. Yeah, I can confirm that there are rumors that we're going to go into a special session.
All right. Awesome. Yes, we will absolutely provide more information as it is available on that. We're going to go into our issue blocks. That's just our talking about legislation that has made its way through. Obviously, one of the big issues facing the nation and legislatures across the country is democracy and how we run our elections. One of the big bills that made it through the legislature is HB 2492, which is a bill that is framed as a citizenship and voter ID bill, but it has a lot of problematic aspects to it. Representative DeGrazia and Representative Abraham, you both serve on the House Rules Committee, which assesses the constitutionality of legislation before it moves on to other committees and to the floor. You both actually voted no on this in rules, which typically you vote yes on the constitutionality. You're not voting on the issue base or how it responds to your values or your representation. Could you speak a little bit to why you voted no on this bill and some of the problems you saw with it, Representative DeGrazia?
Yeah, we see a lot of problems with it. The constitutionality is something that I always look at, and whether it is going to follow through with the fundamentals of Arizona, that every eligible voter should have the opportunity to vote in a meaningful way and not be restricted in any manner that makes it harder for them to vote. I mean, remember that the Constitution of Arizona provides not only that for voting, but also the ability for citizens to bring initiatives and referendums. The voting authority of each citizen is on par, I say, with the legislature. So anything that impinges that or impacts it or reduces it in any way is either directly or indirectly violates our Constitution. So that's one of the reasons I was voting for it. Rep. Abraham can get into a little bit more of the specifics on it, but yeah, huge global issues with these bills that limit the ability of our citizens to vote.
Thank you for that. Yeah, Representative Abraham.
Yeah, I mean, really the same concerns I had as Rep. DeGrazia did. I mean, we have a constitution for a reason, and that's to allow us to not create chaos in our legislation. And that's exactly what this law would do, is it would create chaos. It's unclear if we would need to have two separate voter registrations to comply with this law, a federal one and then a local one. It's unclear if the federal law would have to be held separate. I mean, it's a silly idea to try to do something like this. And so that's why we have a constitution. That's why we have a rules committee. And the theme of this year is that the rules committee, the majority on the rules committee, is just continuing to overlook the constitutionality of some of these laws and passing these. And it's really frustrating. And I hope it stops in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Appreciate that. One of the big things as far as, ignoring the constitutionality consideration is the opportunity for litigation against the state and the resources that it costs the state to either defend the law or, change the law because of that litigation. So it's definitely something.
And I'll jump in to say that this has already been tried and prevailed in this, 7-2. So we shouldn't have to go back. This was already tried at the Supreme Court. And the decision was made. So the fact that we're even hearing this bill is a waste of time, it's a waste of energy, and it's a waste of our resources.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Senator Saul Hamilton. Also on this bill, you in committee had a really good point about the specific impact on tribal voters and voters who have different identification systems through the state. Can you speak a little bit more to some of the potential suppression impacts on voters?
Yeah, boy, I was pretty fired up that day and was very passionate in my vote explanation. But and I've heard in both chambers, in the House and in the Senate. So Senator Hatathali, who lives on the Navajo reservation, actually has to vote in 2 different voting places for her federal elections and for the statewide elections. And then I think it's a 3rd place for any municipal election. So it's really very interesting how cumbersome it is. And then as far as voter ID, it's very hard. Our indigenous tribes have to they jumped through quite a few hoops to get their tribal ID. But the fact of the matter is, there's still a lot of confusion, and Senator Hathathaly's mom passed away when she was 92, and still never was able to get a valid birth certificate and with the correct name on her birth certificate. And in fact, it just was interesting how many different names her mom was assigned, and that was by our government. And so she stood up and explained very clearly how a bill like this would continue to be cumbersome for our First Peoples. And I I reacted strongly to a couple of comments that were made in committee, but even, within our own state, and some people say, well, if you've got a tribal ID, it should be just fine. But sometimes that requires transportation, requires traveling great distances. If there is any kind of clerical error that needs to be changed, the extent to which we expect folks to get an ID, really, it's not as simple as most people would like to think, and especially people with privilege. And so for me, that was one issue that I just was so aggravating. And the other thing is, we really put our county recorders in a tenuous position with this, because the federal regulations have said that the state can't do something different, and yet this would do something very different. And so if our county recorders do not validate the state requirements, or because they've said the federal requirements are good with the box, check the box, asked and answered, they either break state law or they break federal law if the requirements are more stringent on the state idea. And breaking either one of those laws is a felony. And so this bill also puts in effect criminalizing our county recorders. So all the way around, this does not increase access. It does not empower people to participate in our democracy, and folks will lose their voice and their power. So yeah, that was, I was a little heated in committee when I spoke up against that bill.
Your advocacy is greatly appreciated, Senator Stahl-Hamilton. And kind of on the subject of the criminalization and the many election bills that we're seeing, on a twist, this was actually a good thing. We saw on the floor of the Senate March 14th, a Republican senator, Senator Boyer, joined the the minority caucus to not pass a bunch of bills that were oriented around changes to our election procedures. Could you speak a little bit to what that was like on the floor, and just the tensions on the floor and what those issues were about, just vaguely?
Yeah. Our government committee from day one has been dealing with multiple election bills, and a few of those, and yeah, it was March 14th was the day. A lot of those made their way through Cal and to third read. And interestingly enough, Mr. Boyer from the very beginning said anything that will increase voter suppression as he sees it, he would not be in support of any of those bills. And he has in the past been one of those legislators who sticks true to his values. When he says it, he stays true to that. And so I don't know the underlying politics at play, but those bills made their way to the floor, and he voted no on a lot of those. And certainly the minority party were all no votes, and because of the one vote difference, it had the effect of these bills not passing. Now in the Senate, it's a little more quiet. Fewer people give vote explanations. And Mr. Boyer did on one or two of the bills, stood up and explained his vote, but very rarely does he explain his votes, even when he breaks from his party. And I think folks know he's very articulate outside of, off of the floor, and lets people know his reasons. And so he got up and explained one or two votes, but beyond that, it was just quiet. And we spent a lot of time just waiting for the board to be closed, even though we knew he wasn't going to change. I think there was always that holdout. Maybe if we give it a little bit longer, a little more pressure, he'll change his mind. And he didn't. So a lot of those votes fell along party lines. plus Mr. Boyer voting with the Democrats, or I would say voting his conscience, truly.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And that is very true of Senator Boyer, that he is generally fairly consistent about, the ways that he is intending to vote on issues. Well, fortunately, we're going to move on from democracy and elections because that is a darker topic than we would like it to be sometimes. But we are going to move into education and a little bit of healthcare oriented bills. So Representative Abraham, we did see a bill, SB 1211, that is about instructional material being posted online, putting the burden on teachers to make sure that parents have advance notice of what the specifics of their lesson plan are. Can you speak a little bit to that bill and some of the problems that you saw with it and the minority caucuses saw generally with it?
Yeah, it was a great explanation. It's a pretty simple bill on the surface, but first, I think it just continues this theme we're seeing, which is trying to pit teachers against parents. And for some reason, the majority is fixated on doing that. And it's not necessary. And it really adds no value at all. So that aside, though, I mean, the way I look at it and the way I think a lot in our party look at it is it's an unfunded mandate. Teachers are already working their butts off and trying to cover shifts because we don't have enough hired teachers because we don't fund schools properly. And so now you want to add another responsibility to these overworked teachers, and a pretty large responsibility at that. This is going to take hours and hours and hours every single week. And so it just kind of flies in the face of the majority's idea that they want better schools and better outcomes, because this is going to take away from teachers' ability to actually teach our students, which should be their number one responsibility. So a really silly idea comes from a very malicious place of trying to pit teachers against students, and yeah, certainly not supportive of that idea.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, go ahead, Senator.
Yeah, I would love to jump in as well with that. Interestingly enough, those of us who have children in TUSD, there's a system called Parent View, and not every school in the state has this, but every day I can log on and see what my children have learned. Plus, I can see what assignments are missing, what assignments are due. It has an incredible tool that we've used for years in our household that sparks all kinds of conversation and lets us know what our children are learning. And that is, and essentially it's an online grade book. So when the teachers upload everything into Parent View, it is them showing us the grade book, but we have the titles of the assignments and we know what our children are studying. The other thing is, and this is what most of the teachers have said, and especially those who are elected into office, some of the best teaching moments happen when curiosity is sparked and a child asks a question. And you cannot plan for those questions. You can plan for the topic, but and you can sometimes pull in additional resources. Some of the other things that were not addressed, what do our substitute teachers do, right? When you're in the classroom and there may not be enough material, and a substitute teacher is thinking fast on their feet and introduces material that day. This is just an impossible task, and we already have systems in place. Textbooks, curriculum, all of that stuff is already posted online. We are already doing this. It is, I will echo my colleague's words, Rep. Abraham, in that this is really, truly something that is meant to be divisive. It's meant to keep the narrative going that our schools are not transparent and that teachers don't know what they're doing and the parents could do it better. So it's just unfortunate.
Yeah, thank you for that, Senator Saul Hamilton. Along with the policy around how educators are allowed to do the job that they are doing, there's a lot of endless conversation about education funding. As of the last town hall, the legislature had just overridden the aggregate expenditure limit, which was a great thing. And then the state Supreme Court, I believe, struck down Prop 208, which was a sales tax that we passed on the ballot in 2020. So can Representative Abraham, you were mentioning earlier a big bill introduced by one of the majority caucus educators oriented around education funding. It sounds like a huge bill, so we don't need to get into the nitty gritty, but can you speak a little bit to just some of the conversations around the kind of Frankenstein's monster of education funding we have in Arizona?
Yes, this is a massive bill, and I hope in the coming weeks it's on everyone's radar. It's a Udall striker bill, 1269, Representative Udall. And I've spent probably 12 hours over the last 2 days trying to understand it, and I'm not going to go in the weeds, but we'll keep it at a very high level. But so first of all, I said striker bill, and what a striker bill is it's when you strike everything from a previous bill and change everything around. And it's typically done in a rushed fashion. So right out the gate, we are completely changing the way we fund schools with a striker bill without a big conversation and stakeholders. It is being rushed. That alone should be a non-starter. But here we are. So the bill completely changes the way we fund our schools. And it does so in a couple ways. It adds an additional $200 million to our schools, but at the same time requires these district schools to hold elections to opt in to this program by increasing their own property taxes. That is a problem right out the gate, because as we all know, some district schools have an easier time of passing overrides than other ones, and that creates some inequality in our school funding. On top of that, it changes the underlying formulas of how we fund schools. So there's going to be winners and losers. Rural schools are going to be losers, and TUSD is going to be a loser. As a state policymaker, we should not be promoting any policy that promotes winners and losers. We should be trying to lift all of our schools up. And so on top of that, though, this is the kicker. The funding, I said that there was winners and losers in charter or in district schools. There's only winners in charter schools. There is not a single loser for any additional or funding for charter schools. And that's probably the motives behind the bill. So it's really, really concerning. It sounds like it has legs. And I urge everyone watching to keep your eye on this bill, Senate Bill 1269. It's going to be a huge conversation we have this week, next week. And we really need lots of input on that one.
Thank you so much for that, Representative Abraham. Yeah, it's a lot of weird things coming through at the end of a legislative session. So it's good to keep those eyes open, and we're grateful to have you putting that time in to understand these big pieces of legislation. On some other issues, these are a little bit more, we'll stay in the education realm with SB 1165. This got a lot of attention this week. This is a ban on trans kids, trans girls specifically, I think, participating in school athletics. Can Senator Saul Hamilton, can you speak a little bit to this bill that came out of the Senate but was just voted on in the floor this week, and some of the conversations that have been had around this?
Yes, that was one of the very first bills we heard in Judiciary Committee, which was an interesting place for that bill to move through. And I think there was some gameplay there in the Senate. So our first week of committee, we dealt with this bill, and I find it interesting that on the last day of committees, it made its way through the whole process, and folks over in the House voted on this on the floor. Similar legislation has been moving through quite a few of the states here in the US. So this is an outside group coming in promoting this type of legislation. And it's under the guise of protecting women's sports. And honestly, it's not necessary. And especially here in Arizona, the AIA in the last 12 years has only had 12 requests for students. They have a process that's already in place. They've had 12 students approach them. And I think the biggest concern is at the high school level. So we're not talking to, we're not talking about elementary or middle school. We're talking about high school. And the AIA is the Arizona Interscholastics Association. So this is the group that puts in the parameters for our school sports programs, keeps things, reduces risks for liability, keeps things safe, makes sure everybody has what they need in order to be as safe as possible in our sports programs throughout the state. But the AIA has dealt with this on a case-by-case basis. They weighed in neutral on the bill and said, of course, whatever the state law is, that they will abide by state law. But they pointed out that in the last 12 years, only 12 cases only 12 requests were made, and out of the 12 requests, they followed their protocol, bringing in medical care providers, talking to the communities, figuring out, each request getting its own individualized attention. And out of that, only 7 of those requests were granted. It's a very thorough process. And so it's hard for me, that was a head scratcher because we already have something in place. Arizona is new, knows how to take care of business here. And so the only thing that I can assume is that, it just really translates as adults bullying children. Our trans children already are in very vulnerable and precarious positions. Parents jump through all kinds of hoops to figure out how to have safe spaces for their children as they are coming into their own and figuring out who they are. And it's a journey that requires a lot of intentionality. And the last thing, and I will echo what Representative Abraham has said, the last thing that we need to be doing as public servants and elected officials is making life harder, especially for a small percentage of our families in this state. There's no need for it. It is unnecessary legislation. And quite frankly, it comes across as very, very cruel.
Thank you for that, Senator Stahl-Hamilton. It's very, very difficult to watch a legislative body and many legislative bodies talk about, such a small slice of the population as this big, problem when it is demonstrably not by the people who are handling these issues like the AIA. On a similar vein, we had a bill, SB 1138, that focuses on gender-affirming healthcare for trans kids. And that bill was SB 1138. It passed out of the Senate a while ago, and they had the debate on the floor in the House this past week. Representative Abraham, you gave a really good speech about the role of government and what it should be as far as healthcare decisions for people and families. Can you speak a little bit to why you are opposed to this bill?
Yeah, I think, one of the big beliefs that I have as a policymaker is we shouldn't try to solve problems that don't exist. And we should really try to be as thoughtful on assessing the impacts of our legislation as possible. And that was exactly what this was to me. This was a bunch of legislators that have pre-existing values that are trying to force, and force is the real word I mean, those values on the entire state of Arizona. And they're not solving a problem. There's so many things going on in this world right now that we as legislators should strive to fix. This is not one of them. And yet we spent 2 hours on the floor of the Arizona House talking about it. And so it's just really frustrating as a policymaker to see the majority want to take our policy in that direction. And they lose sight of why we're here, and that's to solve problems. And again, I'll say it for the third time, this bill does not solve a problem. There is nothing wrong in the Arizona system as is that needs to be fixed. And so why are we doing something like this? And so that was why I was, one, frustrated to even see that make the floor, but a hard no.
Thank you for that, Representative Abraham. And yeah, Senator Stahl-Hamilton, as a mom to 3 kids, how do these bills that are affecting your ability to parent your children, and especially through the complexities of defining themselves, understanding their identity, how does that affect your understanding as both a mom and a community of moms and the children of it?
No, well, not only does this bill come across as being harsh for families with trans children, but it pulls in the medical community and ties the hands of our doctors who provide gender affirming care. As a mom, oh my gosh, from day one, your pediatrician is your best friend. And especially in those early years, it's so critical. That's where delays are detected. It's, all those the first cold, the first flu, all those things. Your pediatrician is the one that walks you through those kinds of things, helps you understand what things to look for, how to encourage growth and development for your children. And it's not just the physical needs, it's all of it. That's where language is assessed early on. And the care that is provided, it's a partnership. And so for trans children, for our trans children, care is even more critical at certain points, developmental points. And our doctors, our healthcare providers are those partners with parents, helping assure them that they, will help their children navigate this process, and to come at not only the parents, but to come at the medical care providers it's so destructive. And I'll say it again, life is challenging enough, and to place extra undue burdens and prohibitions on the very people who we rely on to help us get our children into adulthood, and help our children know who they are and stepping out into the world, is not the role of government.
Thank you for that. And while we are on this unfortunate subject, there was also in this week in the House, SB 1164, which was the 15-week abortion ban bill. And this is another case of, the government deciding that they should be making medical decisions for people and their doctors. Senator Saul Hamilton, can you speak a little bit to A, what that legislative process has looked like, and B, why this is such a very concerning, both from a health and from a bodily autonomy perspective, piece of legislation?
Yes, I can. And I think it would also be good for Rep. DeGrazia to talk about the constitutionality of this bill as well. This is something that to me, this is legislating morality through a religious lens. And I have serious issues with that. I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this, because I think we are starting to see reproductive health care, reproductive freedom, reproductive choice. It has been under attack. And last year, some extreme bills were introduced, and they fortunately didn't make it through. But now here we are once again, and coming back at this. And some folks, I think, think about dealing with it in whatever time frame in the pregnancy, beyond this point. And honestly, when I first encountered this bill, immediately I thought, oh, this is calculated. And again, I'll go back to this is cruel, because and the reason I say that is because when I heard 15 weeks, and I thought, well, first of all, we shouldn't be dealing with the weeks, but that 15-week time period is very critical, because most insurances will not pay for any kind of genetic testing until after week 16. So if people have to make their decisions before week 16, before they have all the information, it truly is just a clear attempt to take away choice and freedom. It doesn't matter when, but to me, this seems even more calculated, which again, I'll go back to, makes it even more cruel. And for a lot of people, when and how they choose to have their families, that's their business. It is not the government's business. And mandated pregnancies will only place, government mandated pregnancies will only place extra burdens and challenges on the people who are forced to give birth. And again, it's an overreach, and it's not the government's business. And Domingo, I'll toss it over to you for the constitutionality of this bill.
Yeah, thanks, Senator Stahl Hamilton. I was just looking at the bill and to see where it was in the process. So it came from the Senate, passed out of there, came over to the House, just passed out by essentially a party line vote. The problem with the bill and it has some ramifications in several different directions. But the problem with the bill is that it's unconstitutional. We literally have federal law on this topic that says and outlines the ways in which abortion is legal. So by my Republican colleagues in the Rules Committee saying that they believe that this bill is constitutional flies in the face of law and logic. And it just goes to show that most of the processes that we have at the Arizona legislature are, I don't want to say a sham, but they get to be somewhat close to that when the statement by some of the members really is to what they want the world to be, not the legality of what it is. So what's going to happen if this bill gets signed into law, it's probably going to get taken up by a lawsuit pretty quickly. And so Arizona, the taxpayers will have to spend money defending this. And because there is federal law already on the topic, it will lose, it will go down. And we really need to start just tacking on appropriations, because do the taxpayers want to spend $250,000, $500,000, $1 million defending a law that is clearly unconstitutional, that the rules attorneys said specifically this is unconstitutional? That gets to be the frustrating part of my job in rules, along with Representative Abraham. He's on rules with me. We see these bills come through and they're unconstitutional. The assessment of the rules attorney is that they're unconstitutional, but my Republican colleagues want the world to be different, so they pass it out anyway. So I was just checking, it's apparently been transmitted back to the Senate. I don't know what they have to do with it, but we'll see if the governor actually signs it.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I believe the term is called trigger laws for a lot of the abortion related bills, that, the premise that the Supreme Court may change the precedent that exists and allow these bills to no longer be unconstitutional. But in the meantime, voters would be very, very uncomfortable with the bill attached to some of the legislation that we pass and the litigation that comes from it. On the topic generally that Senator Stahl Hamilton brought up of, legislating from a religious lens, we also had a bill oriented around at the intersection of public health and religious exemptions. SB 1567 is a COVID-19 specific vaccine exemption if you have sincerely held religious beliefs. Representative Abraham, can you speak a little bit to this bill and why you and I believe the majority of the Democratic caucuses, if not the entire caucuses, oppose this bill?
Yeah, this one was an interesting one. I have a fun perspective on this one. So this bill would make it impossible for an employer to understand an employee's religious exemption and religious beliefs of why they wouldn't want to take the COVID-19 vaccine. And so I'm in the military. I serve in the Army Reserve. I've been active duty many times in the Army, and we have a religious exemption process, and it's a wonderful process, I think. And the reason it exists is it truly, and you talk to the chaplain corps, they'll tell you the same thing. It's designed to protect deep religious beliefs, real religious beliefs. And it's a simple process where the Army tries to understand the religious belief and whether that's applicable in this case. This bill is another example of the majority just taking a very nuanced issue and smacking it and just saying, nope, we're going to blanket this whole issue with one big overarching policy. And now this is the law of the state. It's a consistent principle we see in the majority of not wanting decisions to be made at the lowest level where all the information exists and just wanting to blanket the entire state with one policy. I think it's a dangerous way of legislating. And again, in this specific case, we have a policy, that if it's good enough for the U.S. military, why isn't it good enough for the state of Arizona? But again, that was the Democrat perspective, but the majority had other thoughts.
Thank you for that, Representative Abraham. And similarly, we had SB 1399, which focuses on adoption and foster care, but through a religious discrimination lens. Representative DeGrazia, your legal background has a lot of work in the foster care system. Can you speak a little bit to just the problems within the system and what this does to help or hurt them?
Yeah, the Arizona foster care system is quite interesting because it puts a very high value on adopting children into other families rather than keeping the family, the biological family, whole or stable. And we would do that by preventative measures, either for mental health or for just housing, education, substance abuse, those kind of things. But since probably about 1998, the federal mandate has gone toward just adopting children out and putting them in different homes. So the problem that we see now is a lot of times, because the Arizona standards are so low for removal of children from families, the outcome is that a lot more kids are facing final adoption, and we run out of foster families. Interestingly, on topics like religion, and especially with things like COVID-19, we're running into a scenario where there are some families that are claiming that the state cannot tell them what to do based on their religious beliefs. So what this bill was running into issues with is that it purports to give foster families, potential adoptive families, basically veto power over how they treat children in their care, whether it's temporary care under court order or potential adoptive care. And we run into things like basic medical treatment. If someone disagrees with getting basic medical care for a child that the state has placed in their care, does the family get to say, no, we're just going to leave it up to faith that this child's ailments will be remedied by faith, or do we go seek medical treatment? And that raises some huge issues. And one of the bigger ones that we get into is with our Native American families. Remember that in the US, the federal government has been trying to break up Native American families for a very long time, such that in 1978, Congress finally passed the Indian Child Welfare Act, the ICWA or ICWA, which gives protections to Native families, not only the biological parents, but the children as well. So we're going to run afoul of federal law on this one. Unfortunately, I believe the bill did pass out against a lot of objection, and we'll see if the governor signs it into law. And then again, how much Arizona taxpayers are going to pay to defending this law, which was called out as being bad law and is going to be unconstitutional anyway.
Thank you for that overview, Representative DeGrazia. And we're going to wrap up this quickly because we want to close out with environment and water. But I do want Senator Stahl-Hamilton, you are an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church, and you've spoken a lot, including with the recent op-ed, about the importance of the separation of church and state. Can you speak a little bit to this bill and the other bills that we've talked about and what it means to have legislators operating from that religious perspective and integrating it into state law?
Right. Well, Senate Bill 1399 does give permission for foster care agencies to discriminate based upon religious grounds. And it's, again, I'll go back to it's unnecessary. The state of Arizona already has a system in place. They have a portal, and for families seeking to be foster care parents can go in, they take the assessment, and the state already will place children into homes and pair and match agencies based upon religious preferences. But this bill makes it so that foster care agencies can discriminate. And I think that the trigger behind this comes from a court case that Fulton versus City of Philadelphia. And the upshot of that case was that it makes it okay to discriminate against families based upon religious grounds, but it is a way of weeding out parents who belong to the LGBTQ plus community. And so it would make that much harder for folks who want to be parents, who want to foster children and potentially adopt. This will shrink the pool of available parents. Now, to that end, I am so frustrated with the lack of separation of church and state. And the thing of it is if we don't have religious freedom, we don't have religious liberty. It erodes our democracy and it erodes our religious freedom. And anytime we step into legislation that starts to talk about freedom of religion, really there are 6 principles that we should look at. Is it neutral? Is it non-coercive? So I can't force my religious beliefs on somebody else and say everybody else has to do this. Is it non-discriminatory? Well, already we've spoken about a couple of bills that are discriminatory based upon the grounds of religion. Is it non-absolute, right? Is it democratic, which means can everybody participate? Is there room for freedom of speech? Is there room for organizing? Is there room for folks on the margin? And then the last one is it pluralistic? We live in a pluralistic society. And so if we were to take these 6 principles and hold them up as we are looking at religious freedom of religion, I think we would find these 6 principles lead us into a better space of tension and looking at protecting our democracy as well as protecting our freedom of religion. And that is something that we don't do so very well in this state. And it is my goal to continue to raise the bar on that conversation and to start pushing back with a lot more force and energy. I find it very troubling how much legislation comes through the legislature that is coming from some sort of religious or theological, ideological lens.
Thank you so much for that, Senator Stahl-Hamilton. I especially appreciate you stepping us through that list and the process to, assess the, role that religion can play as far as how it informs values, but how it shouldn't inform, legislative outcomes. We are a little bit running longer than we expected to as far as our issues, but we wanted to talk quickly about water. That is some water stuff going on in the legislature. The Arizona Department of Water Resources Director Bushatsky has been on the House floor for a few hours the past few weeks talking about water authority and a lot of other big considerations. As I'm sure all our viewers know, we are in a desert and we are always facing water issues. Representative Abraham, can you speak a little bit to what those conversations have been like and some of the things that you're keeping an eye on?
Yeah, so we do have the framework of a water authority bill, or basically to set up this water authority, very similar to a commerce authority. We do know the majority is changing it, so we don't have the exact framework, but the idea is that this entity exists for the purpose of augmentation and conservation. They bring new water here and then they conserve the existing water we have. And so on the surface, they've identified the problem, which we as the minority really believe in, that we have a big water problem here, and that they want to do something about it. The devil's in the details. And on the surface, I'll say my perspective is that this is not a water bill. It's a finance bill. It's a bill that allows private and public players to finance water projects, and mostly in the augmentation space. And so again, the bill is still being written and we're still working on that. But I think my personal belief, and I think I do speak on behalf of most Democrats, is we want to prioritize conservation. There's such low-hanging fruit in the conservation space to save water and better use water. And any bill, any water authority that exists should prioritize conservation. So that's what I'm pushing for. I think that's what many members of the minority are pushing for, and we're hopeful that the majority will understand that and also promote that.
Absolutely. And Senator Stahl-Hamilton, I know you've thrown yourself into a lot of this water policy work, especially as we're losing after this session, Senator Lisa Tondo, who has been such an incredible and very, very smart leader on water. Can you speak to the various discussions that you're seeing on the Senate side and in stakeholder meetings on water and what's going on?
Yeah, there's a lot. And I'll just piggyback a little bit on Representative Abraham comments on this water authority. I think for me, I definitely stand in the space of, yes, we need to continue to think about conservation and push for conservation. There are things that we can be doing better. But with this water authority, the way it's being built and constructed, it would be a 9-person commission, and every one of those seats would be appointed by the governor. And I find that to be a little problematic. And I certainly know that there is a push to see if we couldn't get some of our folks from the universities who deal with water, who are informed and understand what's going on in this state, to have some scientists on this water authority as well. Apart from that, in the Senate, we're starting to see that water and votes on water and ideas about water are starting to be less divided by party. And there's some movement there, and especially because Representative Cobb has been such a voice in the wilderness crying out for her people, and that folks where she lives in Mojave County, their family wells, families who have lived for generations on their land, go to turn on their water and from the sink, and nothing comes out. And so she has done a lot of work at looking at how we deal with water in our rural areas. And I've long said that we do not regulate water in rural Arizona. 80% of our land mass in Arizona is rural. And so we only manage very well, 20% in 5 protected areas. And so she's had a heavy lift, but it is starting to gain some traction. And there have been 2 specific bills that we have heard in the Senate committee that either were pulled because there weren't the votes, because people are starting to listen. And she and Senator Ortondo have worked really hard to find some common ground on how we talk about water, how we think about water. And we're starting to think differently about water transfers. We're starting to think differently about regulation in the rural areas. And I find that to be very hopeful, because certainly right now we read the headlines and there's a lot of concern, a lot of anxiety. This 20+ year drought has really had an effect on the water in Arizona. And so for me, it's been very encouraging. And I'll end with this. Just this last week in Natural Resources, Energy, and Water, 2 bills were heard that actually ended up putting Tucson in a very good light, which that just felt really good, because sometimes I feel like we get picked on quite a bit down here because of the choices we make and how we govern ourselves in Tucson. But Representative Liguori has a water harvesting bill that actually made its way over to committee in the Senate and passed out. And all of the work was based upon the work that we've done here in Tucson with our water harvesting. And even Brad Lancaster, who does a lot of the passive water collection, which is how we landscape, was pointed out and brought up in committee. So our praises were being sung in NRU. And then the other piece, the legislature is starting to look at glass recycling. And we know that that's a very costly program. But again, that is something that we are doing in Tucson. And we got an incredible shout out about the glass recycling program here. And so it was kind of fun to see how, with just in regards to the environment, some things are moving forward at the legislature. Policy is being crafted, and we got to be a little shining star there for a brief minute.
Thank you so much for that, Senator Saul Hamilton. Yeah, I was watching that committee, and as a Tucsonan, it was really cool to see the programs that we have down here being, lauded at the state level for the, conservation work and the, better use of our resources that we have down here. Representative Abraham, I'm going to throw it to you because we do have a local election actually coming up that you want to mention.
Yeah, speaking of Tucson doing wonderful things, we have a City of Tucson election, Proposition 411, and it is coming fast. Ballots will be mailed out on April 20th. So this is a reauthorization of a 1/2-cent sales tax. The majority of that money goes to funding roads. It's something that's a priority for mayor and council. They've demonstrated over the last 5 years how responsibly they've spent the sales tax, and they're asking for a reauthorization. It's something I'm personally very supportive over. And so it should be on everyone's radar, since we're going to be voting on it really, really soon.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, and I know Grant Road is out of LD10 jurisdiction, but it's a little painful to get through the construction, but it's much nicer on the other side. So look forward to that ballot in your mailbox. This is an all mail ballot, so every voter, no matter what your early voter registration is, will be getting a ballot in the mail. The last 2 announcements just before we wrap up, just general pandemic update. While the Board of Supervisors has removed the mask mandate for Pima County, I would encourage everyone to continue masking up. Some of the data that we're seeing from Europe and the East Coast suggests that we are in for a potential another wave in the next month or 2. But if you or any of your family, community members, friends have not gotten vaccinated and boosted, we will be posting the link to the Pima County Health Department in the chat and on the YouTube description. So please encourage everyone to get fully vaccinated and boosted. And to that, the Pima Council on Aging is also continuing to run their Take Your Shot campaign. And so that is, you sign up for a shift, you go door to door with a list of voters and ask them if they are vaccinated and boosted. And if not, ask them, make a plan with them or talk to them about, some of the concerns they might have around that. I did a shift about a month and a half ago, and it was really, really good. I intend to do another one in the next few weeks. And so So I would encourage everyone to participate in that. You can go to pcoa.org/how-you-can-help/volunteer. Again, I will be posting this link and contact information in the video description. Thank you all for joining us today. We will be back with the one last town hall after budget is passed, after sine die. We will come back to the constituents of LD10 with an update. Thank you, legislative team, for participating today, and feel free to send your send-offs. Say your send-offs.
Yeah, thank you all. It's great to be with you, give you this update and what we're anticipating in the next couple of weeks at the Ledge.
Yeah, thanks everybody. It's good seeing you all again. We're looking for budget at the next update, but thanks to all for joining us, and feel free to send in questions or topics that you are concerned about. Thanks.
Thank you all for spending your Saturday with us. Appreciate it. And yeah, feel free to reach out, give us feedback on the bills you see.